Hello, everybody. Welcome to an episode of the Russia Report. And I'm delighted. I've got this amazing panel of experts, truly hundreds of years, I think, between them of Russian expertise. So I shall go around and try and introduce in some sort of vague order. We have Edward Lucas, who has been studying Russia for Ed, I was going to say dozens of years, but that can't be right. And the author of many books and a great expert, in fact, on the workings of the ISC committee. We have Anne Applebaum, who is celebrating the publication of her book, Twilight of Democracy, today. So we're very pleased to be with Anne. We have Luke Harding down here, who is a correspondent with The Guardian, who has also written a book with extraordinary timing called Shadow State. We have Bill Browder here. Bill, have you got a copy of your book to read?
It was 5 years ago.
5 years ago. Red Notice. So Bill is a businessman who was kicked out of Moscow for being a threat to national security and has been campaigning against Russian corruption since. And we have Catherine Belton, who is a correspondent, an investigative journalist with Reuters, who has also got a remarkable book out just very recently, here, wave it around, Catherine, called Putin's People. And we have Tamsin Shaw, who is not going to wave a book around, but is joining us from New York, where she is a professor of political theory. Oh, there we go. She's waving around the Mueller report. So listen, thanks ever so much, everybody, for joining. This is very impromptu and sort of slightly experimental doing it on this Zoom format. But I feel really pleased that you're here and you're going to help make sense of this moment. And I'm really delighted, actually, that I know that some of you feel very cheerful and pleased about today, and which is a good antidote, because I've spent quite a lot of the day feeling slightly furious about it, I have to say. I am completely gobsmacked that we have found out today that essentially the tiny group of journalists, essentially, who've been trying to investigate what happened in the referendum were the only people in the country, it seemed, and the intelligence services actually have done nothing at all, and the gates to our democracy have been wide open and are still wide open, and the threat from the American Silicon Valley platforms are still absolutely a threat, not just with Russia, but with all these other nations. So anyhow, on the other hand, I know that some of you feel very jubilant. And Luke, you told me you did a little dance earlier. So perhaps I wanted to go around very quickly and see how everybody was feeling, really, to get sort of take temperature of the room.
Yeah. Well, I sort of tweeted the Russia report just after kind of 10 o'clock this morning, and I was sitting with my Guardian colleague Dan Saber, and I have to say we behave like Millwall fans in this cavernous, COVID-voided kind of building, and we're kind of dancing around the room and shouting, going yes, 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 and this may seem a bit hysterical and juvenile, but you, Carol, better than anyone, everyone on this panel knows that we've been pretty remorselessly targeted by pro-Brexit people, by the Leave campaign, and called conspiracy theorists and idiots and so on. And actually, it turns out that we were right. We were right to warn of Russian interference. We were right to make parallels between what happened in the US in 2016 and what happened in the UK with Brexit. And we were also right to say that the politicians were looking the other way, like a tribe of ostriches, really. So today is frustrating, as you say, but also I think it's kind of vindicating. And I, for one, feel extremely cheerful.
Anne, you said we should all jump up and down and join in the chorus of "I told you so." Do you still feel like that? Talk me through that emotion.
Yeah. Yes, I do have some of that emotion. I mean, I agree with what Luke said. What I liked about the report, though, was it reflected the range of Russian threats. It talked about the money in British politics. It talked about disinformation. It talked about cyber. It talked about spying. And so it was more well-rounded than I would have expected it to be. and it also presented pretty clearly, gave you a good sense of what Russian strategy is. Why is it that the Russians care about Britain? What is it that they're trying to achieve here? Why is it that they're, why is their object to push British democracy in a way, in a direction that's useful to them? I thought it was one of the first times I've seen that kind of sober assessment of the range of threats that's not written by one of us or someone like us, that it came from a kind of official government state committee, and it acknowledged that these things are real and that they can matter and they can have influence. And it was sort of a relief to finally see it.
What about, Catherine, I want to go to you, because you spent 7 years researching your book in this kind of exhausting detail of trying to uncover hidden facts around some of these oligarchs and Kremlin contacts. How did you feel to see a few paragraphs on this in the only report that we've had from the Russian government? What was that emotion? What did that bring out in you?
I actually felt relieved as well. I agree with Anne. It almost felt like all of a sudden the adults in the room had stood up and said, look, this threat is real. And they point out very bluntly in the report that they recognize that the UK now faces a threat from Russia from within its own borders. And this is incredibly important to point out. And I was also impressed by the detail that they went into, obviously without naming names, but they did sort of point out very bluntly that Russian business is inextricably intertwined with the Russian state and also with intelligence, and that the lines are very blurry between this. And this is very important for us to understand, particularly when looking at some of the donors, for instance, of the Tory party and these sort of high-placed individuals that we've all written about as having influence on the on the Brexit campaign.
What about, tell me, so Bill, you've been touring the world for I don't know how long, going around all sorts of different parliaments and warning of the risks. But yet, I'm really interested in the international comparison in the way that you found that was received elsewhere and the way that it was received in Britain.
Let me just back up for 1 second and say that, so we all had convened together on Sunday, and we tried to predict what was going to be in the report. And none of us had any predictions other than this sort of vague feeling that it was going to be a disappointment because so many things coming out of parliamentary committees and governments are. And so when I picked up the report this morning, and I was expecting it at 10:30, and for some reason Luke had got hold of it like early, I don't know how, and put it out. And I started going through it, and I was trying to find something wrong with it to be disappointed. And I kept on reading the words, and everything was really good. I mean, it's like, where's the problem here? And it was just like hard hitting. This was like multi-party, conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, Scottish nationalists. Everybody was coming down hard on the government for being asleep at the wheel, and going into really tough detail and about all this stuff. And I kind of, after about 10 minutes, I concluded this is actually pretty good. This is not bad. And for me, the really good part, and Catherine just mentioned it, is that I've been going around the world trying to explain to people that it's not just the GRU and the SVR and the FSB, these 3-letter acronyms for Russian intelligence agencies, but there's a whole sort of informal network of crooked oligarchs who are using their money to advance Russia's malign interests. And they're doing it in partnership with enablers, with people, UK citizens. And for me, that detail coming out explicitly and very well articulated in this report made me feel like really pretty great, because up until now, I've kind of felt like people, when I would tell people about this in lawmaking bodies or in governments, they would all like kind of look at me like, I'm some kind of fantasist and conspiracy theorist. Now we have the Intelligence and Security Committee basically coming out and saying it clearly, that as I've been saying it, and I think that there's going to be some consequences for these enablers in the future, now that it's becoming sort of a mainstream concept and not just something that people like me and Catherine and Ed and Luke and so on are talking about.
Well, it's great to be in the company of such eminent conspiracy theorists, I have to say, today. Including, actually, I'm going to go to you, Edward. So I saw you, I think it was a couple of months, I mean, it was just shortly before the pandemic hit, I think. And you, at the time, you said, the thing is with these reports, they are so astoundingly boring that you have to sort of read through the lines to find anything juicy there. And so my expectations were set to extremely low, I have to say. And plus we'd had all of the government briefings about what a damp squib this was going to be, how there was no smoking gun. Were you shocked when you read it today?
Yes, I was delighted, shocked and furious and slightly scared all at the same time. I was delighted because I've been banging on about this since the 1990s and have had a fair amount of criticism for it, and not least from people in government who said this was scaremongering and nobody serious. They called it, the Foreign Office, it was called Crazy Edward Lucas talk. So it's very good to see all the points that have been mentioned here, including, I would just add, the overlap with organised crime. It's not just business and intelligence and politics, but also organised crime, and they highlight that. And the breadth of the threat, it's not just about the tip of the spear, the intelligence and security services, but all the other things. And that was the main message I gave when I gave evidence to the committee at its first session, was look much more broadly than you normally do. I'm furious because of what it reveals, that the guardians of our national security have been asleep on the job. Clearly there was some effort in MI6 and in GCHQ to keep an eye on the traditional issues of high-level decision-making, at least the military and nuclear side, making sure that Russia doesn't penetrate our own services. But the broader threat was not a priority there. And even in MI5, which is self-tasking, they're supposed to make their assessments and set priorities on the basis of the threat they see. They didn't do this. And this contemptuous, really, response to the committee's request for information about election interference, 6 lines of text, most of it apparently referring to open source material, is really shocking. And I'm furious about that, and I'm quite scared because I don't feel that the government is in a position to get to grips with this. Even since the committee formed, what we see is jargon, PowerPoint presentations, fancy sort of new units and things being set up. But to deal with this threat needs a root and branch reform of the way Britain works, about the way in which the professions work, the way in which the city works, the way in which different bits of government work together and in fact don't work together. And I just don't feel we're anywhere near this. So I worry that, and the contempt that this government shows for the work of the committee, which is so important, this contemptuous, preposterous, flimsy excuses for postponing the publication, and now the way they're trying to bat this away and say, no, we deal with all that. That really troubles me. I really fear for the future of the security of this country if a report like this, with what it reveals, doesn't create an absolute U-turn. It should be a revolution in government, and I don't see it.
I feel really heartened that you're furious, actually, Ed. Because as I say, that's so absolutely my response. And because I'm going to go to Tamsin now, the stark contrast, and they use those words in the report, the stark contrast between what has happened here and what happened in the States. And they note the fact that they had the first report into Russian interference, intelligence report into Russian interference after the US election 2 months later. We are 4 years on, and these brief crumbs are really the only thing that we've got. And as I say, the investigation hasn't even begun. So Tamsin, can you talk to me about how you felt sitting in New York seeing this today, knowing what's going on in the States?
Well, I feel good for all of the British journalists that feel vindicated because they've been told that they're crazy conspiracy theories. But I'm sitting in New York with my copy of the Mueller report, We knew about Russian interference. We knew that it involved Britain. I mean, this is considered a very narrow report. It's been wide. Luke was just criticizing it for being very narrow. It's many, many pages long, and the evidence is thousands of pages. So, yeah, it's nice to have an admission from the British government that the UK is that Russia is interfering in elections, but what we're basically told in the report, I feel, is stuff that we already knew. I was talking to Carol from day one about the fact that there had been an enormous focus in the intelligence services on counterterrorism at the expense of other geopolitical threats like Russia, and that this would be considered an intelligence failing because of that. And indeed, the report says it's a failure of intelligence because there weren't the resources, because we were also focused on this. And we set up this initiative between the Ministry of Defense and GCHQ, which had these great results for Daesh, but didn't really do anything about Russia. And I feel as though we knew that and that would be an embarrassment. But there are all of the questions that follow that, like who knew what when. I mean, MI6 are directly answerable to the Foreign Office. The Foreign Secretary, of course, was Boris Johnson. Maybe in 2016, you could say that you won't get intelligence briefings telling you enough about what we knew on Russian interference, but we know now enough to ask the questions that we should have asked then. So, for instance, everything in the Mueller report that just describes the involvement in Britain of people like George Papadopoulos mysteriously meeting with the Australian ambassador to the UK, and not just that, but then in September meeting with Tobias Ellwood, who was the undersecretary in the Foreign Office at the time. I would like to know, why wasn't that examined? What did Tobias Ellwood know? What did Boris Johnson know? There are just so many questions for me. So yes, the intelligence services weren't looking in the right direction, but we've known since 2016 where they should have been looking, and yet this is all we have was, oh, sorry, we were looking at terrorism.
Well, I can tell you, well, I can't tell you what Tobias Ellwood knows, but I can tell you that I sent him multiple, I think more than 12 press inquiries asking him those questions when I found that out at the time, and he didn't respond to any of those. I don't know if Tobias, if you're out there and you'd like to answer those questions now, we'd be really interested to hear them.
Yeah, I'd love to know a lot more about what was going on in the Foreign Office rather than just blaming the intelligence services.
Well, so I wanted to throw this question open actually. So I tweeted earlier this very striking speech that the head of MI6, Alex Younger, made in December 2016. Now, we know from the later report that apparently he was drawing upon bits of the Steele dossier here. But he makes this, it's this very stark warning. It's about, he says that the internet has revolutionized the threats to national security and that hostile states are using them to exploit our weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And it seemed, when it was pointed out to me, that it seemed very much like a warning. But it was this sort of a warning to who? And I wondered, Ed, do you have any theories on what do you make of that at the time? That his boss at the time, of course, was Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson's boss was Theresa May. And that was when they were beginning perhaps to understand the scale of what happened in the States and the questions, therefore, about what happened in Britain earlier this year. Do you think there are more questions there, Ed, or what do you think that was about?
Well, it's called the Secret Intelligence Service for a reason. So, it's not the easiest reporting target. My impression is that the more you know about Russia in MI6 now, the more worried you are about what you see. This is quite a change from 15 years ago, when it was deeply unfashionable to be a Russia hawk. And as I've noted in previous things, a lot of the real Russia watchers deep expertise were squeezed out or sidelined or put onto other things. So I think that the willingness of MI6 is, as you say, subordinate to the Foreign Secretary, and I think there's been certainly a bit of friction on that front, and the very stark terms in which Alex Younger, I think if we're talking about the same speech, briefed NATO ambassadors, was an unprecedentedly public warning from the agency. One of the problems is that they don't, there are three things that really matter here. One is international finance, where their capabilities are very weak. People who are, MI6 doesn't have many accountants, particularly not sort of forensic accountants. So they are really stuck on dealing with that. They don't really deal with the threat inside Britain, because that's obviously up to the other agencies, and so they may find leads that point back into Britain, but then they go into the ground. And then the third thing is they are fundamentally subject to the political tasking that they get from on top, and I think there is the real weakness. It's the Cabinet Office and Downing Street and the ministers who are perhaps most red-faced on this. Although I have to say, I'm also really struck by something people hasn't really noticed very much in the report, which is the scalding rebuke delivered to the agencies for their lack of cooperation, and the repeated use of a very, a narrow but powerful exemption, which says that they can't be expected to comment on ongoing operations. And it says that they've used this exemption to an unprecedented extent. And I'm talking to people involved in the report, I get the impression there's considerable annoyance about the way in which their work was impeded up to the process, the point at which the report was compiled.
I mean, actually, I'd really like to. Can I just go to Anne briefly, because I feel this is sort of like connects to Anne. Your book is literally called "The Twilight of Democracy." And, you're writing about these populist authoritarians. We're talking about a populist authoritarian, Boris Johnson, who there's really damning evidence about his involvement in here. Can you talk about the political reaction to, what's been uncovered in the States, and what you've made of the sort of political reaction here, I suppose, and this highly, highly partisan nature of what should be a national security debate?
Yes, that's a really important issue. And this is, maybe it's a kind of warning for Britain. If you look at what happened to the Mueller report in the United States, as you say, the Mueller report was very thorough. Mueller found and identified by name GRU agents who had orchestrated a social media operation in the United States. They traced the money. They found out how they'd set up their Facebook accounts and so on. It was great. There's like amazing detail, and all kinds of links between the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, and the Russian, various, I won't say the Russian government, but various Russian elements and fake lawyers and so on. And what Mueller then did is he sort of presented all this evidence to Congress and said, I'm not going to connect the dots for you. It's up to you now to decide what to do about it. And Congress, particularly the Republican-dominated Senate, decided to ignore it. The Trump administration decided to spin it, so they put their William Barr, the Department of Justice, kind of downplayed it, underrated it, framed it as something that wasn't a big deal. And we now have a kind of new narrative in the United States about how this didn't really matter. It was all made up. It was all fake. Nothing really happened. And the danger is that if you have political parties who are using these kinds of tactics themselves. So we're talking about whether it's populist, authoritarian populist language, whether it's fake websites, fake Facebook pages, trolling, plus the use of dirty money in politics. You then have a lot of reluctance on the part of those kinds of parties to admit that there's any Russian influence, or if there is, to downplay it, undermine it. It's all exaggerated, and so on. And so the risk here is very similar. In other words, that you could launch an investigation. I mean, because this report is really at the beginning, right? It doesn't name any names. It doesn't have too much, it doesn't have detail. It doesn't say which Russian oligarchs are giving money to which members of the House of Lords. There is a risk that if you began to investigate that, and if it became a partisan investigation the way it became in the United States, that it wouldn't have the effect that you want. In other words, whether it would be the Tory party would say this is all just a left-wing attack on us, or so it's very important, I think, Carol, the way you frame the way you asked the question, to make sure that everybody understands that these are national security issues. This isn't just about the Brexit vote. The tactics that the Russians use could be used by a different regime in the future. I don't know, the Iranians or the Chinese. They could be used against the Labour Party. They could be used against the Tory party. They could be used, I don't know, against the Scottish National Party. And understanding the way that foreign money works and the way that foreign disinformation works ultimately is good for everybody in politics. And it's really important that this not become some kind of partisan political issue. And as I say, the danger is that precisely because the tactics that the Russians were using in the Brexit campaign in 2016 were pretty indistinguishable from the tactics that the Tory party were using. The danger is that the Tories, see, or at least the Tory Brexiteers, seek to downplay this because they'll somehow see it as a...
Yeah. So if I can leap in there, because this is exactly what we saw happening. The Daily Telegraph came out last night with this sort of like no evidence of interference in Brexit. And, it was, the Telegraph, whatever you say, it used to be a very good newspaper. It took things like national security very seriously. It's now acting as part of the right-wing disinformation network that we see, in operation all of the time on these other subjects. And it was really good. I think it was really heartening. I don't know. I think I might go to you, Luke, now, is that, we had a Conservative MP sitting there saying, this is not normal. This is wrong. They have lied. This is pretty strong stuff, isn't it? And you'd hope that that would get it across, that this is not a party political issue.
You would hope, but the problem is that the kind of the pro-Brexit sort of hard right faction of the Conservative Party are implicated in all this. And just today, when the committee gave a press conference after the report came out at 10:30, I asked Stuart Hosey, the SNP MP who sits on the committee, about Aaron Banks. And whether the committee had investigated Aaron Banks and his multiple meetings with the Russian ambassador. And you could see a sort of stiffening that he was clearly afraid of this question and basically said, well, we put him in a footnote. So the answer is that they didn't. And I just want to pick up on what Ed was saying earlier on about the failure of Whitehall, of government and the spy agencies. It is incredible. If you just briefly reprise what's happened over the last 2 decades, we've had a concerted multi-level attempt by the Russian embassy in London to cultivate a particular faction of the Conservative Party and to push for Brexit. We had this infamous garden party in 2012, organized by the Conservative Friends of Russia, attended by no less a person than Carrie Symonds, the Prime Minister's soon-to-be wife. We had Matthew Elliott, who ran the Vote Leave campaign, who was there as well. And then if you fast forward, we had this mysterious spy who seems to have fallen from an Ian Fleming novel called Alexander Udot, who was liaising with Aaron Banks, Andrew Wigmore, introducing him to the Russian ambassador, offering gold or brokering gold deals and so on. And what I find amazing is that MI6, you would have thought, and GCHQ would have some oversight as to what was going on inside the ambassador's residence, what was going on inside the embassy, conversations, intercepts, a fair guess as to who they were targeting and why. And yet we don't know this. And not only do we not know this, the ISC don't know this. And I just, one other thing is, I wonder what we do now. We journalists, we citizens, we people who are following these things, because it seems to me that after Johnson has ruled out any kind of proper investigation, that unfortunately it falls to us again to carry on investigating. And I would just plead with anyone who is watching, who maybe has access to some of this stuff, leak it. If there's ever a moment to leak now is the time to leak, because otherwise this historic fork in the road in the UK's kind of destiny, we're never going to quite know why we took that route, whether Russia co-caused Brexit or didn't. And I just think at the moment we cannot accept the vote in 2016 was legitimate until we have more information. So we need more information.
And you know what, I'm just going to, I think Ed had his hand up, but I'm very briefly just going to say something actually, which is tonight's show is being brought to you by a little group of people who have come together to help around these issues actually. And it's been a group of volunteers, we're called the Citizens, and it is essentially because it is, you know, the idea that these investigations are being left to a tiny group of investigative journalists who actually aren't, we all know how difficult it is to publish, and we all know how difficult it is in terms of standing up to these different oligarchs and interests and the legal threats that involve. Maybe, Catherine, it's to go to you there, because you've been digging away, haven't you? And you've taken on some really powerful and rich individuals. How does that make you feel, knowing that actually you were there doing that as the intelligence services we don't know what they were doing. They were just hanging out and filing their nails, apparently.
Well, I guess we did know that they had dropped the ball, and we did know that they've been consumed with chasing the terrorist threat. I think, yeah, I mean, we've had to deal with a lot of legal threats and all kinds of issues along the way. But I think, I mean, the key question that we do face now is, of course, what happens next? How Boris Johnson's reaction? I mean, he's clearly just hoping that this is going to die away and they're not going to do anything. But Luke put it particularly kind of rightly, that this is a fork in the road. We do have a chance to actually kind of put a stamp on this and actually take some actions. The ISC has recommended that there's more funding for the National Crime Agency to investigate dirty Russian cash. We need a foreign registration act for foreign agents to register, so that we know whose interests business people, law firms, PR firms are acting on behalf. We have this real opportunity to take some actions, but if the Boris Johnson government isn't going to even do some kind of retroactive assessment on Russian interference into Brexit, then it's almost like we're stuck in kind of the same situation. I mean, it's just difficult for me to imagine how they will take any steps when we do know from our own reporting and your reporting, sort of, for instance, the kind of the ties that Boris Johnson has had with Alexander Lebedev that Luke has reported on and also his ties with Alexander Temerko, this Russian businessman that I've been reporting on, who was the head of a Russian state arms firm. He's always painted himself as a Russian dissident, as a critic of the Putin regime, as an anti-Brexit supporter, but actually all his best friends in the Tory party have been the most pro-Brexit individuals. And he also had one of his own employees running Boris Johnson's leadership campaign, and he admitted to me that he was behind an attempt with the ERG to oust Theresa May, to try and sort of finagle a way for Boris to take over the leadership. And that was confirmed to me by a senior Tory party source. So it's very difficult to see how Boris Johnson and the Tory party can actually take some steps on this when they're so kind of deeply attached to their Russian donors.
But this, I mean, isn't this kind of terrifying though? Because as you say, you know, Boris Johnson is so deeply in bed with these Russian oligarchs, with this taking Russian money into the Conservative Party. His relationship with, for example, Alexander Lebedev. I'm sure you did what I did, which was to cut, control and find of certain people who obviously were not there. I mean, this money element is so, I mean, Bill, if I can go to you, is that it feels that the problems that we have here in Britain are really systemic. I mean, there is something profoundly corrupt that we have now uncovered this corruption. The Intelligence Committee is highlighting these threats, and the government is actively trying to suppress this information, that it successfully suppressed this report before a critical election. I mean, I don't know, does this remind you of Russia in some respects?
Well, I think you're all being a little too pessimistic here. I'm an activist. It took me 10 years to get a Magnitsky Act passed in the UK. You can't judge and say, look at it now, it's also terrible, let's just throw our hands up in the air and be mad at everything. I view this as a really great development as an activist. As an activist, I see this as, I've been trying to convince everybody of all these things that were in the report for a long time, and now it's in a report, a credible report, cross-party report that nobody can challenge, as say it's some kind of biased exercise. And now we can build on that. And as Catherine said, there's some recommendations in the report. I'm not going to let the world ignore those recommendations. I'm not going to let how is it a bad idea to have transparency about lobbying? Who can argue against that? I mean, everyone has sort of talked about it. America has a Foreign Agent Registration Act, and that requires anybody who's lobbying the government to say whether they're lobbying on behalf of a foreign government, and they have to write it down. They have to disclose it, and a lot of disclosures are pretty interesting. We don't have that. Why don't we have that? It doesn't make any sense. Now all of a sudden, and people have been talking about. I've been talking about it. And Bob Seeley, who's a member of Parliament, has been spearheading that, and all of a sudden now it's in a report recommended to the government based on evidence of Russian wrongdoing. I'm going to run with that. I'm going to keep on banging that drum and run with that. Well, similarly, we have been trying to get the UK National Crime Agency to investigate the money laundering connected to the Magnitsky case for 10 years. They've refused. Everyone else, France, Spain, Switzerland, Lithuania, Latvia, America, they've all been investigating and in some cases prosecuting. The UK has not opened an investigation. All of a sudden it's in a report saying that this is a huge deficiency and the NCAA has done nothing. Well, that helps me a lot when I'm trying to put pressure on them to investigate and start doing this stuff properly. And so I kind of think that this is a really good development. I mean, yes, we live in a totally dysfunctional, biased place where everybody is maximizing their own narrow personal interests. That's the way that the world works. But we have this gift now, which is a credible report, which I think will help. It will certainly help me in the next steps of this thing, and every step is incremental.
Oh, well, Bill, I love that. Thank you so much. I need a bit of that energy and optimism. But I'm going to, Ed, there's this question I think that you just put in the chat about. So talk to me about this report. I mean, which we only know about because Dominic Grieve stood up in Parliament and said that they'd sent this report to Downing Street, and Downing Street had refused to release it back to the committee. Now, this report was supposed to come out ahead of the general election. And if it had come out of the general election, there would have been a ton of questions, I think, wouldn't there? And you have to ask, would there have been a different result to the election? I mean, I'm throwing that over to you. What do you think? Oh, you're muted, Edward.
Yes, it's interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have parallel universes in which we can run these experiments and see what would have been different. And my feeling is, having read the report, I think that Boris Johnson should have published it and would have got away with it, because he'd have said, yes, this is all absolutely shocking. And if we get into when we win the election, we'll beef up our security and defence, which is a good, strong conservative issue. They said that Jeremy Corbyn is a Russia lover and Kremlin stooge and so on. That would have been another one. He could have said that there are already efforts underway to clean up the city. He would have highlighted the fact there's now a Russia unit at the heart of government. He could have. So I think that it would have been. It didn't have a smoking gun on election finance. And its shock about the lack of information about election interference. And let's remember that the report hasn't said that there is evidence about election interference. All it said is that there is a shocking lack of interest in the services, and that there was the amount of open source information about operations in Scotland after, in fact, it says related to, but it means after the referendum, certainly suggests it's worth further inquiry. So I think he could have got away with this. I think it's a sign of his sort of, this kind of paranoid control freakery, maybe, that it was thought too risky. Maybe there was a bit of spite towards Dominic Grieve, and it would have thought that this could put a bit of wind in the sails to the Tory rebels. At that stage, we didn't know they were all going to lose their seats when they're running as independents. But I think you look at this very much through the commendable focus of your investigations into the Brexit campaign and the funding there. Most of the report is about other things, and I think it would have been presented to the public more broadly. And some of the MPs on the committee were pro-Brexit. So I think one has to be a bit careful about crowbarring it into this very strong narrative that you've done so much to find facts to underpin.
Well, it's very. I'm just going to jump in there, and is that the whole thing about it is I didn't come at this investigation with any thoughts about Russia at all. I was investigating the big tech platforms. That was the optic that I'm looking at all of this through, and the lack of security there. And it was looking then at the individuals who were exploiting that then led me to Russia. So it is. I do come from a different angle, but maybe this is where I come from a place of higher alarm in some ways, because I look at the way that those platforms are now going to be used in this massive critical election in the United States in just a couple of months, and I find it kind of terrifying. And that when you have that kind of technology allied to a would-be autocrat, then you don't need Russia in that respect. But anyway, sorry, that's me bang on. Tamsin, was it your hand, I think?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if it had come out before the election, there are a lot of questions that could have been asked, not necessarily related to Brexit, but given the intelligence failures, you could have had Theresa May and Amber Rudd, who were both Home Secretary in that period, ask questions in Parliament about what was going on with MI5. MI5 would have been accountable to them. You could have asked Boris Johnson a lot of questions about what was going on with MI6. But also, since the recommendation of the report is to have much more multilateral, international cooperation over these issues, and that being the only way to proceed with it, then the special relationship between the Tories, like Boris Johnson, and the Trump administration is a really serious area to look at there, because a lot of people question whether, if there's a second Trump term, the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement will hang together. It has so far, but to the amazement of some people, because many people see there being very, very serious compromises potentially, given who has security clearance in the US administration right now. And I think it would have been a really good thing to ask all of those questions before the election and not after it.
So Luke, if I can go to you, we've got tomorrow's the last day, I think, isn't it, before the recess in Parliament. So there is this tiny, tiny window of opportunity. What questions do you think that MPs should be asking? And what have you made of the political reactions so far? I just very quickly earlier, I was like, what's Keir Starmer had to say? And I looked at his Twitter feed and I was like, oh, how fascinating. Keir has said absolutely nothing on this, which shouldn't come as much of a shock, because the Labour Party has generally said nothing on any of this. But what's your suggestions, and what do you think is going to be the reaction?
Yeah, I mean, Keir Starmer has been a little bit disappointing. I mean, you can't just sit this one out. It's huge. It's about the whole direction this country is going in, and whether it was a just and fair decision, or actually whether there was some kind of illegitimate kind of pushing going on. So I don't know if Keir Starmer will man up tomorrow. The SNP had a good day. I thought they were pretty strong. Stuart Hosey was impressive. I mean, what I'm curious about is the names. These are people we talk about all the time, that you investigate, that Catherine investigates, we all write about. Mr. Temeko we've talked about, but also we haven't talked about Lyubov Chernukin, who's become the biggest female donor in British political history. She's given almost £2 million to the Conservative Party, married to Vladimir Putin's former deputy economics minister. I don't think it's tenable. I don't think these Moscow-linked oligarchs can continue to shovel huge sums of cash into the Conservative Party. And I would hope that MPs would ask about the status of those donations. And I hate to go on and on about the Lebedevs, but nowhere in this report did we get any answer about the Prime Minister's mystery trips to Perugia, to Italy, his off-the-books meeting 2 years ago with Alexander Lebedev and God knows who else. That there's a sort of counterintelligence question mark about the Prime Minister himself. I know that sounds strange. I'm not suggesting he's a Russian asset, but we need more information, and we need whistleblowers. We need to be more American. Brits seem very craven. I did a piece for the New Statesman for the weekend saying I expected someone would leak us, me, you, the report. No one did. So we need some sharp questions about money and oligarchs, and we need more leaks. And also, lastly, we need to, people are going on holiday, everyone's going to the beach. August is going to be dead. But we do need to come back to this. I don't think we can stop, because then Johnson's relying on people's cynicism and apathy. And then, of course, he's won.
Well, I'm just going to, Anne's got to leave us in a moment, but I'm just going to leap in and say, I had a really hair-raising chat with Rachel Johnson, actually the Prime Minister's sister, about a Lebedev party. So I'm really hoping that she might fill us in on a few of those juicy details that I heard. Maybe there's some enterprising journalists you can go and ask her about those. But anyway, Anne, you've got to head, I think, in a moment. Is there some sort of final thoughts that you've got?
I think, look, the next stage is filling in the blanks and naming names and understanding what are the real relationships. I mean, and this is, by the way, moving well beyond Brexit and into the real relationships between people in the city and people in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords with Russia. I mean, I would like to stress to viewers that this isn't something that ended in 2016. This is an ongoing attempt to influence British politics. And remember, what are Russia's interests? To push Britain away from the EU, away from NATO, to isolate Britain as much as possible. That's a kind of isolated Britain, sort of all by itself in the middle of the Atlantic, is exactly what Russia wants. It wants a country that it can, where everybody's so desperate to do any kind of business deal that all Russian dirty money is acceptable. And tying the names and the figures to particular people and bringing this story to light is really the next stage of this story.
Catherine, you've got a question for Ed. Do you want to put that to him? It sounded interesting. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, the main question is, what are the practical steps now? I mean, the ISC has made its recommendations. Does the UK government actually have to respond? Do the UK security services have to respond? Or can they just kind of say, thank you, that's very nice, and walk off into the sunset?
I'm afraid it's the latter. There is no formal response required. There can be one. And you could have, for example, select committees holding hearings on aspects that came out of the report. So you might have the Digital Culture, Media and Sport committees already doing disinformation, Defence Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, so they can all pick the ball up and run with it. With a government majority of 70, there's not much chance of a sort of big backbench revolt. But I do think the really big thing that's actually coming up now is China, and there's real concern in the Conservative Party about China. They had to change their minds on Huawei, partly because of American pressure, but also because of a looming backbench revolt that some people around here helped instigate. And I think that in a way, China's got under their skin in a way that Russia didn't. And of course, the vulnerabilities that Russia exploits are pretty much the same as the ones that China exploits, although there are some differences. So I think that the task for people who want to hold the government to account on this will be to make sure that the attention on China includes and also Russia does this, that we try and do some compare and contrast. I think that it's also worth noting that the previous Intelligence and Security Committee had just started getting going on an inquiry on China, and it'll be, I'm sure that the new one, now that Julian Lewis is in charge, will do it. Will pursue that. It'll be interesting to see whether they get the same obstruction from the agencies and from Downing Street that the committee did with Russia.
I've got so actually I'm just going to I build this like amazing optimism that I need to go back to this kind of like, well, it's you might take 10 years, but this is like a step in the right direction. In terms of getting to the truth, just give me some words of what, in terms of getting to the truth of what actually happened in these elections. What do you think? Do you think that the truth will one day out?
The truth always comes out on everything eventually. I mean, it's kind of stating the obvious that Vladimir Putin doesn't like groups of countries. He doesn't like the EU. He doesn't like NATO. And he wants to break them up. And there's nothing that makes him happier than to break up, to have Britain leave the European Union. So of course he's going to do what he can to tip the balance. And I also disagree that the intelligence services don't know what he was up to. I'm sure they do. I'm sure their 6 lines was just staying out of it because they didn't want to end up in this terrible fight like we're seeing in the United States right now, where if you talk about Russian interference, that becomes a partisan issue. And I think they just wanted to stay out of it. Of course, Russia was involved. Did they tip the balance? I don't know. It was a pretty close call. They certainly tipped the balance, I would say, in the United States, because Trump only won with 70,000 votes in 5 swing states. And so 70,000 votes in a country of, more than 300 million people is very doable by, trolls and bots and Facebook ads and all that kind of stuff. How will anyone ever prove what happened with the Russian interference, whether it had anything to do and cause the outcome? I don't know, but the truth will come out. There will be more information coming out from all different sides. It always does. I mean, I'm amazed at what we've been able to find out over 10 years doing the Magnitsky investigation, and I'm sure we'll find out a lot more about this thing. We might not find out in a time that's very satisfying for anybody, but we'll eventually find out. But I view this as a very strong. I think today's a good day. I don't know why you're all getting so upset. It's a good day. It could have been a really bland report that said nothing, and then I would have been mad. But it was a good report. It said a lot, and it got everyone focused on the right issues. And now we just need to run with that stuff.
But now we need. So yeah, well, here's where we need your advice, Bill, because the committee has said we need an inquiry into what happened in the EU referendum. The DCMS committee has said we need an inquiry. I mean, that was stated very, very strongly in the press conference. So how do we get one? What's the secret?
Well, maybe you don't get an inquiry. I mean, maybe there's lots of different ways to skin the cat here. It's not, if that's the only definition of success in uncovering the truth, then maybe you don't get what you want. But if your objective is to say, okay, there's, I mean, all the articles that I've read say that the government was asleep at the wheel. That's the general consensus. That's the consensus that most people have in the country, and that's not a great and it wasn't this government that was asleep at the wheel. So this government could, in theory, say we're not asleep at the wheel. We're going to do some stuff, and I'm sure that there are people backbench, front bench, opposition that feel strongly about this. So it's your job to report. It's my job to advocate. I'm going to be talking to the people on all the different benches about what to do about this, and I think I'm going to get a lot of receptive conversations from that, and perhaps different types of actions. And will it be an inquiry into the Brexit referendum? Probably not. But I think I'm going to get some stuff that will move the ball forward as far as I'm concerned, which is to hold Russia accountable for what they're doing here and make it harder to do it in the future.
What about Tamsin? Actually, yeah. I was going to say, do you think in Britain we fail to heed the warning of what is going on in America?
Well, I think Britain is in a tricky position because in America this is seen as a largely partisan issue to do with the GOP and their relationships with Russia. And in Britain, it's not. It's bipartisan. You read the report and it says after 2000, we realized that, that Putin wasn't the modernizer we expected, and we became more skeptical through the 2000s. But I seem to remember the TNKBP deal being celebrated by Blair and Putin in 2003. And I seem to remember an awful lot of Russian IPOs in the city during the 2000s, which made Britain effectively the financial center of the world for a while. And I think there are a lot of people with a lot of interests that they probably will want to cover. And without an effective opposition party demanding a proper inquiry, I don't think there's much hope of there being one.
What do the rest of you think? Do you think there is going to be a bun fight in Parliament tomorrow? Do you think we are actually going to see some blood on the floor?
Yes, I think, I just jump in here. I think Lisa Nandy was really strong today. And I think we've now got, for the first time in years, a Labour opposition which sees an opening for hawkish, patriotic foreign policy, being tough on Russia and tough on China. And I'm deeply encouraged by that. And there's some very serious Labour frontbenchers. Nick Thomas-Simons, the Home Secretary, I'm sure is going to be onto this, the failings of MI5. Lisa Nandy, I've mentioned already. There are several other ones, also Kevin Jones, who was on the ISC. So I think that, perhaps I was too pessimistic earlier on, and I like a fight. I've been fighting this since before the Soviet Union collapsed, and I shall be standing shoulder to shoulder with Bill as he tries to embarrass the government and highlight to the public what's happened. And I think we will, it does give us useful ammunition. But what I'm shocked about is how weak this government's response has been, both in terms of trying to delay the report, but also from stuff I know independently of the report, just about how we've basically done nothing over the last year and a half, and the threat from Russia has grown rather than decreased.
So I think we've just got a couple of minutes left. Does anybody have anything burning they'd like to? Oh, Luke, go on, get it off your chest.
Yeah. Just very briefly, we're all celebrating. Bill is especially upbeat, but I suspect in the Kremlin they're also probably popping open the champagne today because it makes them look really good, right? They medal, or do they medal? ? But again, they're seen as a kind of great international actor that bestrides the world's stage and shapes events, but also they're great adversaries, they're great enemies. MI5, MI6 look as if they're basically on tea break the entire time and sitting around in an English way while these hyperactive Russian spies do stuff. So, they've done their usual thing of saying this is all a conspiracy, the Brits are sucking their fingers. But I think they'll be well pleased with the way things have gone. And of course, the other corollary of all that is they will keep going. As Anne was saying earlier on, they'll keep going. Putin's in power until 2036. He plans to live forever. And Russia, for us lot, I suppose, is the dark gift that keeps giving.
Okay, well, Catherine, do you have any final words you'd like to say?
It's mainly a question. Can this sort of fact that now there are headlines everywhere saying that the UK government has been asleep at the wheel over the Russia threat, is that going to be enough of an embarrassment really to stir them into action? Perhaps they'll try and shovel the Russian Tory party donor issues under the table. But does it mean that perhaps they'll give more funding to the National Crime Agency to go after money laundering and illicit cash flows? I mean, if that happens, then that's great. But they have to give more powers to the NCA. I mean, as we've seen in the inquiry into whether Aaron Banks, the source of his funding for the Vote Leave campaign, we know that the trail of the NCA stopped in the Isle of Man, that they weren't able to go any further than a loan that he received from a murky financial company he co-owned in the Isle of Man. So of course he denies any wrongdoing, but we know no more about sort of where that money came from. So the NCA really has to be empowered to have sort of greater scrutiny of these type of offshore entities.
And in fairness, the Electoral Commission said of that they know it's been proven now that the law, we do not have the electoral laws which stop foreign money coming into the country. That was what they said that this proved. And so we literally have not a single piece of legislation that protects us from that. And that's, you know, ongoing. So anyway, sorry, I really didn't mean to end it on a gloomy note, and yet there it was. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been really interesting, has actually lifted my spirits a bit. Thank you, Bill Browder and Tamsin Shaw and Luke Harding and Catherine Belton and Edward Lucas. It's been really, really an honour to have you all discussing this. So, and thank you, and fight on.